our fourth and final week of talking about liberation theology. Victor's done a fantastic job walking us through.
Thank you.
Yeah, different elements. We've really very much enjoyed this, Victor. The conversation we've had after class and between classes has been really, really great. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge here on this with us. We're also really hopeful. A few of the YouTube videos of these sessions are up online on the church's channel. So please go and view those or send those to your friends or whatever if you want to continue the conversation. We're really happy to have those, and thank you for Victor for okaying that we put those up. For our last week here, we'll be talking about South American liberation theology, which is kind of its own brand of things. And so I'll open us in prayer here, and then Victor, it'll be off to you. Dear Lord, I pray you make us people of peace, people who walk the path of peace our whole life, people who lead others into the path of peace. We pray that you help us to achieve peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our homes, peace in our troubled world. We pray, Lord, that you help us to be peacemakers, that you aid us to work for peace, that you send us upon the path of ending bitterness, that you send us along the path of friendship and forgiveness, and that you let peace permeate into our lives so that they may be lived in grace and love, and so that at the end of our lives we may obtain the reward of peacemakers. Lord, I just ask that you allow us to do this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Ben. All right, can everyone see my slide? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming to the last day of our series on Christian liberation theologies. Let me give a quick recap of what we've done in the last 3 weeks. In the first week, we looked at the different ideas of liberation in the Bible. We also looked at some of the liberative motifs in the Bible that have shaped many Christian liberation theologies. In the second week, we looked at Dalit Christian theology that began to gain prominence in the 1980s in India, even though the initial ideas emerged in the 70s and possibly earlier. And in the third week, we looked at Black liberation theology, particularly its American version, that really arose in response to racial-based segregations and dehumanization in the US. Today, we are going to look at Latin American liberation theology, which also began to arise in the late 1960s. Latin American liberation theology first arose in response to the spiritual quest of some Catholic priests to understand the practical implications of Christianity's teachings on God's salvation, particularly as it relates to the process of embodying liberation of people that have been oppressed. The Peruvian theologian, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, framed the spiritual quest in the following way. To speak of a theology of liberation is to seek an answer to the following question. What relation is there between salvation and the historical process of human liberation? Now, Father Gustavo Gutierrez raised this question in the late 1960s. In fact, at a small meeting of Catholic priests, which preceded the famous Second General Council of Latin American Bishops in 1968 as well. But it was his first attempt to formulate his ideas of liberation theology. Among the several factors that caused many Latin Americans great suffering at the time the liberation theology movement emerged, material deprivation or material poverty figured prominently. Many Latin American Christian theologians, Catholic and later also Protestant, really explored what it meant to imagine the Christian idea of salvation and how best to relate it to how to tackle the sufferings of those that have been pushed to the peripheries of their own societies, especially the poor. I think it would be very helpful to talk about some of the contributing factors in the unpleasant life situations of many Latin American Christians and, in fact, communities in general at the time that liberation theology emerged. I will talk about some socio-economic factors, some political factors, and some religious factors. The major social economic factor was really poverty and inequality. As many looked for work and moved out of their villages to cities in search for jobs, and as the economy of their country shrunk, many began to worry about the life of many Latin Americans who were toiling and working very hard, but still suffering gravely as a result of poverty. There were issues of destitution. Many were living in deplorable conditions in shanty towns. And for many Catholic theologians, they wrestled with how and the best way the church can get involved, not only in alleviating the sufferings of the poor, but also in going and countering or tackling the societies or societal structures that caused poverty and inequality. And it's quite interesting that during this particular period, many South American and also in other parts of the area that we call Latin America today really, really suffered greatly. But there were also optimism about prosperity. But as many of these communities began to realize that all of their optimism about prosperity isn't quite materializing, they began to evaluate the causes of their suffering. Many worried about unequal access to and distribution of their nation's wealth. There was also the problem of an immense gap between the rich and the poor. And those who were very rich and who were powerful also, in some ways, colonized their own people. Now, beyond the social economic factor, we also have to wrestle with political factors. The main political factor really was the brutal military regimes in many of these countries. And many of these regimes used excessive force to gain control over their own countries. The Archbishop Oscar Romero was one of those victims of such repressive regimes. He was assassinated in 1980 in a church building while celebrating Mass. And it was quite interesting also that even on the day of his funeral, bombs went off. Many people were killed. Many also were shot. And one of the interesting things about living under repressive and oppressive regimes is that when human life is seen as worthless, it is a recipe for violence, for killing, and in some cases for murder. I mean, I grew up in Nigeria, and for most of my life, while in Nigeria, I lived under military regime. And I really experienced firsthand what it meant. You hear the language of being disappeared, which was a metaphor for saying being killed. In Latin America, a lot of people were disappeared for having the courage to speak up against the oppressive regimes. And it's quite interesting, and this is also one of the areas that many Latin American liberation theologians have been criticized. Some of them, some of the priests, engaged in revolutionary resistance against some of these oppressive regimes. Some actually joined guerrilla military camps to fight against such oppression and repression of their own community. But let's move on to the religious factor. Now, many Latin American liberation theologians really love Pope John the 23rd, for he gave a very powerful speech that he entitled Mother and Teacher. And in that particular document, he really emphasized the need for the church to freshen its own house. It's almost like to clean, to bring fresh air, to refresh their own way of thinking that have in some ways disregarded the suffering of people and many other social issues in their own society. In the words of Pope John the 23rd, as for the problems which face the poorer nations in various parts of the world, we realize, of course, that these are very real. They are caused more often than not by a deficient economic and social organization which does not offer living conditions proportionate to the increase in population. They are caused also by the lack of effective solidarity among such people. Now, this is quite important because, as we're going to find out today, many Latin American theologians have embraced the idea of the preferential option for the poor. The idea of taking sides, siding with the poor in their struggles, being in solidarity with the poor in their struggles for liberation. Now, Pope John the 23rd was the one who called the Vatican II Council. He didn't quite live to the conclusion of that very council in 1965. But the seed he planted, as we're going to find out later, led to the Vatican Council and many Latin American liberation theologians who were working in the late 1960s and 70s were actually attempting to implement some of the ideas that were raised at the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican Council called for the churches to confront and deal with social issues, including poverty. In one of its documents, it states, never has the human race enjoyed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power, and yet a huge proportion of the world's citizens are still tormented by hunger and poverty, while countless numbers suffer from total illiteracy. Never before has man or people had so keen an understanding of freedom, yet at the same time, new forms of social and psychological slavery make their appearance in the world. The Council, the Vatican Council, called attention to the devastating effects of the widening gap between those who have and those who did not have, between the rich and the poor. Many Latin American theologians who were interested in liberation theology will attempt to explain and to embody some of the issues that were raised at this very famous Roman Catholic Council. And as I said earlier, they wanted to implement the Vatican II summons. Now, Catholic theologians disagreed on how exactly to go about implementing or putting into practice the summon to tackle social issues. There were some people who were convinced that the church probably should be praying for a change of situations and to perhaps for God to intervene, but didn't really want to be involved in terms of either joining the revolutionary movements. Others, on the other hand, insisted that the church must take side and the church must support, must get involved, must join the revolutionary movements that are designed to alleviate the suffering of the people. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that there were some disagreements on how to put this into practice. They agreed that it was important for the church not to be silent, but they disagreed on how exactly the church can accomplish this task. And we can see this issue being debated in the several conferences that Latin American Catholic bishops had beginning from 1968. But Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who was one of the prominent figures at these conferences, argued that the church must take sides and the church must, in fact, provide some theological grounds for engaging and for addressing, for tackling not only poverty itself, but the structures that create and sustain, and in fact, in some cases, perpetuate poverty in Latin America. For some people, though, anytime Latin American liberation theology is mentioned, they think it was just simply a Roman Catholic project. And that's quite inaccurate. Because, I mean, the Latin American Catholic bishop held their conference in 1968 in Colombia. In 1969, about a year later, Protestant evangelical Christians in Latin America also held their own conference. And a year later, in 1970, they will establish what is today known as Latin American Theological Fellowship. Ruth Padilla de Bos has been one of the prominent figures that have really led Latin American Theological Fellowship, which was founded in 1970. She is one of those Protestant evangelical theologians that are quite interested in embodying the gospel. In her own words, in Latin America, as in North America, the challenge to all who identify as Christians is the incarnation of a socially committed spirituality that draws deeply from the wells of faith, hope, and love, and engages in the deep, complex, and painful realities of its context with the hopeful proclamation of a different reality. The church must be socially committed. And this is quite interesting because if you think about the influence of Billy Graham evangelistic ministry in Latin America at this particular point, that largely focused on the salvation of the souls, but didn't quite attend to social realities. Many of these Latin American theologians wanted to talk about the salvation of the souls, but also become socially committed in terms of tackling social issues in their own societies. So I think it's quite important to remember that it wasn't just Latin American liberation theology, wasn't just a Roman Catholic project. It was also, in some ways, a Protestant project. Now, as we try to wrap up my talk, I want to really quickly talk a little bit about Father Gustavo Gutierrez and to highlight some of the major themes that I have discerned in his writings. And many regard him, and rightfully so, as the founder, or in some case, the father of Latin American liberation theology. One of the major themes that have shaped Father Gustavo's writings is his discovery of what he describes as the irruption of the poor, which he defined as the poor being aware of the causes of their own suffering of their own poor condition. And it's quite interesting that, I mean, he spent most of his time studying in Europe. When he returned to Peru, his home country, he realized that his fancy theological education that he got from Europe didn't quite prepare him to deal with the kind of theology that was needed, not only in Peru, but in many South America, to tackle the problem of poverty. For him, the eruption of the poor's ability to recognize the causes of their poverty, that they are not destined to be poor, but that their poverty is largely caused by unjust structures. He argued that this act of eruption, this experience of eruption, posed several theological questions to Christian theologians. Let me highlight two of such questions. What does a life of the poor say about God's love for humanity? And secondly, what does the expandable life of the poor say about God's gift of life? Another thing that I've discerned in Father Gustavo Gutierrez's writing is what we might describe as the Christian-Marxist Dialectic. And this is, of course, one of the areas where he has been heavily criticized. Now, it is quite important to remember that for Father Gustavo Gutierrez, a good theologian should not be trained to interpret the Bible and church tradition. A good theologian should equally be trained to interpret the society. And he believed that Karl Marx helped him to really learn how to interpret his own society, to discern what are the causes of the sufferings that are related to poverty. Now, he goes out of his way to say that he does not attempt to synthesize the Christian faith and say Karl Marx's ideas, but rather he borrows from Karl Marx some of his interpretation of the causes of poverty in his own society. Here is his own words. It is to a large extent due to Marxism's influence that theological thought, searching for its own sources, has begun to reflect on the meaning of the transformation of the world and human action in history. Now, to be very clear, Father Gustavo Gutierrez blames capitalism as the prime culprit in the large-scale poverty that was present in Latin America. He didn't quite like the idea of development economics for the fact that he claimed that it led some of the developing countries to depend largely on the so-called developed country. He was also very critical of development economics because he says, well, it can bring about wealth to a nation, but it doesn't quite tackle some moral and ethical issues, such as the practice of exploiting workers. Now, development economics, of course, could be traced back to the Polish economist, Rosenstein-Roden, said, well, one of the ways to deal with poverty is to get some of the developed countries and corporations, big corporations, to go into the developing countries and invest in several areas. And of course, for Father Gustavo Gutierrez, you could do so. You could raise the nation's capital or GDP, gross income, but it doesn't quite really tackle the issue of poverty, because you might come to a situation, as in the case of Latin America, where you have some people who have all the wealth and a large number of people who had nothing. Another theme that I have also discerned in his writings is a a concept that is very, very popular and very, very central to the idea of liberation theology. And that is the idea of a preferential option for the poor. For him, if we are really serious about tackling the problem of poverty, we must see first from the perspective of the poor, and we must be driven by the quest to liberate them from their own suffering. In his own words, this option, referring to the preferential option for the poor, involves a commitment that implies leaving the road one is on, as the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches, and entering the world of the other, of the insignificant person, of the one excluded from dominant social sectors, communities, viewpoints, and ideas. Now, he does agree that there are different ways we can tackle the problem of poverty from the point of view of, say, a religious tradition. But he's very convinced that the idea of a preferential option for the poor is a robust and an effective theological response to the problem of poverty. Let me quickly talk about what preferential is and how he understood its meaning. It is an embodied commitment to the poor's quest for liberation. It's not simply a concept. It is something that must be put in practice. And this is why it is very, very important to Latin American liberation theologians and many other liberation theologians that when we talk about theological ideas, we must also explore how it must be put into practice. Sometimes they use the word praxis, a way of living that is thoroughly grounded in right beliefs. To commit, in this case, is to participate in the poor's struggles to be emancipated from their dehumanizing condition. This involves calling out and condemning the structures that create and perpetuate poverty. It also involves working to create opportunities and access to such opportunities for people who are poor to escape material poverty. He does recognize that it could involve what we might describe as charity-based solution, give our money, give our resources, work with charity organizations. But he also believes that what we need the most is a transformation-based solution, which involves rethinking our structures, changing our structures, making them just, making them in such a way, or remaking them in such a way as to create opportunities and access to opportunities for everyone. Now, again, this is where he favors socialism and dislikes capitalism. The poor, for him, are those who are deprived of the basic necessities of life, such as water, food, healthcare. In fact, he describes poverty in some ways as to die. To be poor is to die, not just emotionally or socially, but in some cases physically, because people are dying, at least he saw people dying of hunger and malnutrition. He problematizes poverty, in other words, turning it into both social and theological problem. And one of the questions that he's raised each time he discusses poverty that has stayed with me is, how can you say to a dying person that God is a loving Father if that person is dying of poverty and dying of hunger or dying of malnutrition? How can you bring yourself to that person dying of hunger or malnutrition or curable diseases that God is a loving Father? He's convinced, though, that the idea of preferential option for the poor is really grounded in God's preferential love for the poor. For him, the God that is revealed in the Bible, the God that chose to become one of us, not in a person that it was very wealthy, but in a poor Galilean, Jesus of Nazareth, has made a very strong statement about his position when it comes to how to deal with poverty. And that was by choosing to incarnate in a poor Galilean, God has made it very clear that God takes sides, that God sides with the poor in their struggles for liberation. I want to quickly talk about some of the problems that people have raised and some of the criticisms that have been addressed to liberation theology. I'm just going to highlight you and then I'll open it up for questions. As many of you probably know, a lot of people are very critical of Latin American liberation theology because of the influence of Marxism. And many of them endorsed socialism and rejected capitalism, at least as it was practiced in Latin America. Here are the words of one critic. The difficulty with some forms of theology of liberation is not that they should have the church become flesh in a socialist system. Such an attempt, to the extent that is genuinely compatible with the gospel, is good and even necessary wherever socialist systems are given as a part of the situation. The real difficulty is rather the attempt to link the church in an exclusive and an indissoluble way with these systems to the point of rejecting all others as incompatible with the gospel message of liberation. And of course, many Latin American theologians have responded, like the Brazilian theologians, brothers Leonardo Boff and Clodovis Boff, that, well, of course, we are not just simply borrowing Marxism, we are using Marxist ideas to explore what is going on, to discern the problem we have in our community, and to think of how to respond to it. All right, I think I will stop here. If we have more time, we can talk about other problems, but let's open it up for questions. Hopefully, I've been able to at least introduce this idea and to highlight some of the things that are important to many Latin American liberation theologians.
So I just want to make it clear, it hasn't been clear before. We're all on the call together. Nothing has to go through the chat if you don't want it to. Feel free to flip on your mic and ask questions directly to Victor or each other, just to have this be kind of an open discussion. But if you're uncomfortable with that, it's okay to use the chat as well.
Hey, Victor, I just want to start by saying thank you for, I guess, just giving us the whole big picture. I really appreciate that. And I'm kind of glad that you ended up with Latin American theology. I think I would have started there because that's where it started. But by bringing it in at the end, you've helped me to understand some of the nuance that has gone into it. So I appreciate that. I've been chatting over here with anybody who's listening about as I was going, and you started to address it with the Protestant response. But I thought, man, it seems like evangelicals have really lagged in terms of, like what I just wrote was preferential love for the poor. I was thinking, because I'm an old guy, that back in the 70s, well, maybe the 80s, in a group I was with, and college group I was with, what we cared about was let's reach the decision makers and the wealthy people. As I say it out loud, it sounds ridiculous, but you know, there's always that. But now when I hear this, your encapsulation of it, Jesus, you know, a preferential love for the poor just seems, I can't pick up my Bible anywhere and not see that. I see it all the time. I see it in almost every passage I read every day. So I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think for me, Victor, one of the things that I so appreciated the presentation you just did is this acknowledging the issue with Marxism, and that's getting blended very much in some of the discussions today. Even Black Lives Matter being a lot of ideas coming out of Marxism being anti-capitalistic and things like that. So I really appreciated you acknowledging that, and then just showing us even briefly the dialogue that's going on there with liberation theologians arguing that they venerate the gospel and Marxism is merely a tool. And it isn't even the tool. It isn't like you're swallowing the whole pill, but you're using it in this kind of nuanced way. It understands some things can help us understand some things. And we don't have to buy into Marxism in order to use it in this kind of toolish way. I just really appreciated the nuance of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've found a lot of things to think about, and I don't know if my thoughts are coalescing really well, but I think that acknowledging problems in our structures, and I think that's becoming clear in recent times, fortunately, that here in America, there's problems with our structures that make it so that not equal opportunity is not really there. And that's something that we as Christians need to acknowledge and work with. I appreciate that. I do wonder about the phrase, the poor, conjuring up a mass image of people. Sometimes I think that term is misused because they're a whole bunch of individuals with different concerns and people with ability to act on their own. My husband and I went and lived in the inner city for a while, and I think I had a glamorized view of the poor as somehow the poverty itself purified people, and it doesn't. As I'm sure you know, from poverty doesn't purify people. It makes, but I just wanted to comment on that phrase, the poor, if it doesn't allow us to see individuals and listen to individuals.
Thank you, Chris, for bringing that up. Thank you.
Hey, Victor, I just wanted to ask you in your summary of Gutierrez, you thought he produced at least 2 theological questions, and I think I got them here. But what does the life of the poor say about God's love for humanity? That was the first one, yeah. And the second, I think, was, what does the life of the poor say about God's gift of life? Did I get that right? Was that the second one?
Yeah. What does the expandable life of the poor say about God's gift of life?
Those are good questions to think about, and very far-reaching questions for me.
And those that, if you look at his writings, these are some of the questions that have shaped many of his writing that I have at least read. He's written extensively. He's written quite a bit. He's written quite a bit. So those are important questions to him.
I might have missed it. Was he a Catholic priest? Did I miss that part? He was. Okay.
He's a Roman Catholic priest.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting because, you know, a lot of popes that came after Pope John the 23rd didn't quite appreciate what he was doing. If you look at, say, for example, Pope John Paul II was very critical of people like liberation theology movement. Pope Benedict, who was the Cardinal Ratzinger, also was quite critical. In fact, some of the great criticisms of liberation theology came from some of those Catholic priests. Now, it was quite interesting that when Pope Benedict when he assumed his reign, he invited Father Gustavo Gutierrez to the Vatican, which was a very interesting statement because many of those liberation theologians were, in some cases, deprived of conducting Mass, celebrating Mass. You were kicked out. So yes, he's a Roman Catholic theologian.
I have another question. In Latin America, was progress made with, did liberation, this philosophy make any inroads into the problems that were experienced in a lot of these countries?
It is a very, very important question. Very, very, and I'm glad that you brought this up. There are some people who think that, well, because of, let me go back a little bit. There are some Latin American priests, Catholic priests, who decided to join guerrilla groups to fight. Now, we also know that some of these repressive governments really use force to get control of their country. So for some people, well, it didn't quite, the cost didn't justify the movement, you know, the cost of life, the repressive stuff. But for others, know that it raised a very important, at least in the consciousness of many Christians and non-Christians, and as you might know, Roman Catholic tradition still continues to be the primary or the major religious tradition in many of this country. But it raised in the consciousness of many of these people why it is at least the issue of poverty and how they can fight for their own poverty, how they can seek liberation, and how they can use their own faith to justify their desire for liberation. So it depends on who you ask. But it's always raised. In fact, you hear a lot of people who say that, well, it didn't quite do as much as perhaps it should have. But it's quite difficult to, I mean, as someone, I said it earlier, I grew up in Nigeria. It was only in 1999 that I actually experienced in the Nigerian context a democratically elected president. Prior to that time, it was purely military regimes. I mean, countless of people, priests, pastors who were killed. Sometimes they come to your church while you are preaching and just take you and does it. And so it's very difficult to really make progress in such context. If you are judging by the physical thing you are seeing, but I think that some of the values of liberation theology we continue to see even up to today, you know, because as many of these countries change their regimes and leadership. Yeah, again, each time I read Latin American liberation theology, it reminds me of my experience growing up. My dad was a pastor, and I feared for his life several times because my dad will be one of those ones that will always say something. Sometimes you hear a knock at the door, or you think, well, you know. So, yes.
Hey, I just want to jump in again because I read a book, a novel by, I think, an American, but it was called Imagining Argentina. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this novel.
No, I have not read it. No.
Man, it was a good book, but it really demonstrated, and they had this guy had these green Ford Falcons driving around the country, disappearing people. If a green Ford Falcon showed up, and this was a thing in Argentina at some point, you know, people were disappearing, and you know, it was a great novel, and there's a lot more to say about it. But I wanted to just ask this question about solidarity. It was in one of your slides, and I think it is a useful term, although it has a vaguely Marxist sense to it. But I like the notion of solidarity because feeling one with the poor, I think is a thing. It seems like that's a thread we could embrace. And I know that probably some in our community have done that way better than I have, you know, but I feel like that's a thing. It's a way of thinking about us together that is frankly in stark contrast to one of the ways that I've thought of myself or my faith is that of sort of a separatist kind of a deal, which I'm becoming less and less comfortable with over time.
Kirk, I think it gets at your comment and question about evangelicalism making a turn to embrace the preferential love for the poor. That seems like such a huge thing for me. And I appreciated the language in there because obviously we're called to that biblically, and yet that is a turning of the cruise ship for sure. And it's a staggering thing to think about it, and how we as a church community, we as individuals do that daily and do that corporately. And as evangelicals who are in that pietist tradition of me and God. So
Yeah. Jane, I so appreciate that. It's hilarious that you said turn the cruise ship. But
well, I heard Mark one time. We were new to the congregation, and I think it was about the beautiful long time front of
that God's eye thing?
the banner.
Yeah, okay.
And he talked to coming down, and we were part of listening to that process. And he said something about turning Salem's ship. I just added cruise for.
Well, the thing I was going to say was, I wonder if our ongoing sort of unquestioned commitment to capitalism, and I'm a capitalist, I'm so just confessing here, is that part of the root of why we cannot do this? I wonder.
I wonder too.
I see this message mixed into why we don't care for the poor. It's because everybody's bootstraps, you know?
Yes.
So I'm masked, so you can't see my lips moving, but I do wonder how much what does it mean to do preferential treatment? What does it mean to be in solidarity? What does the poor need from us? Because I'm not poor. I will own that. I'm not poor. What does the poor need from us to be seen as being in solidarity? How do we do partial treatment, and how would it actually reach a point at which solidarity is felt?
Yep.
And I mean, I can respond, and I hope that others can. We only have 3 minutes, because I'm really enjoying this. Sorry, Ben, but I think one of the things I've learned is for many liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez, it is important to recognize that even when we are trying to say be in solidarity with the poor, that we don't become their own voices, right? That we help them to discover their own voice. And one of the ways that we could do that is at least to provide the opportunity for them to work and be paid well. So it's not that you're given. Charity-based works when you have an immediate need. If I'm hungry, I don't have the luxury to wait for a system to be changed. I need food, right? So we can get food. But then if you want a long term, if you're thinking about the dignity of these people, that it is also important that we focus on how we can make our structure in such a way that it will be access to it is very important. Access to opportunity. Access to opportunity. I mean, I said this, I wish we had time, but all of my education from the undergraduate to my doctorate have been by scholarship. I grew up, my dad was an evangelical pastor, not a contemporary Nigerian Pentecostal pastors that are very, very wealthy. And we're not going to get into how they get their money. But I grew up poor. Without such opportunities, I wouldn't have even gotten enough. Access is important because I think, and they make a lot of, at least some of the Latin American liberation theologians make that very clear, that transforming our society and helping people to gain access to resources. People are poor not because they are lazy or that they don't have the desire to work. In some cases, it's because they don't have access to it. And I'm sorry, Ben probably understands this. I'm still being influenced by British systems. So I like my time was, so I'll stop here. I see your Aberdeen shirt. I don't know if you knew this. I went to Edinburgh. I studied at the University of Edinburgh. So Ben and I have some Scottish connections there.
Yeah, that's right. I think that now. Did you know Dave Ferguson there at Edinburgh?
David Ferguson?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. So whenever I go to Aberdeen, he travels up to Aberdeen frequently, and so we sit and chat a lot. I've chatted with Dave many times. So.
I think he's going to Cambridge now, right? He just got that chair at Cambridge.
Yeah, if he does, I probably talked to him a year and a half ago before COVID, and he was still solidly at Edinburgh. So maybe he has moved.
Guys, I think he's got a position at Cambridge. So
I'm going to leave and go to the service. Thanks,
all right,
everybody.
bye everyone. Thank you
Yes.
so
We-
much.
I
I'm not saying others need to go, but
Thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you. Bye.
Fantastic.
All right.
Bye.
Victor, bye. Victor, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I have a series of questions still. I think I might email you a few of them, and I think that they're pretty easy. But thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Victor. Wonderful stuff.
Thank you, Victor.
And maybe next year we'll have you back on another topic. That'd be awesome.
It'll be wonderful, or even the same topic to keep exploring. So
There you
thank
go.
you so much.
Right. Victor,
Enjoy
blessings.
service all.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.